All right, here's section 6 and its focus question. Federal authorities came to supervise the transition from slavery to freedom as the war came to an end and more Southern territory came under Union control. Conflict over access to land, control over labor, and new structures of political power took place in South Carolina, Louisiana, and other parts of the South. The best known of these rehearsals for Reconstruction was the experiment on the Sea Islands off the South Carolina coast. In late 1861, the Union Navy occupied the islands and whites fled, leaving 10,000 enslaved people. Northern Army officers, cotton plantation investors, and black and white reformers came to reconstruct the island and lift up the island's blacks. Northern-born teachers believed education would make the formerly enslaved people independent and productive citizens, and they started schools. Although the enslaved people's most basic demand was for land to farm themselves, some Northerners believed free labor for enslaved people should take the form of wage work, which was more humane than slave labor. When the land was sold by the federal government, it went mostly to Northern investors who wanted to show the advantages of free labor and make a profit. By 1865, Sea Island black families were working for wages, gaining an education, and enjoying a better material life than under slavery. A very different experiment took place in Louisiana and the Mississippi River Valley. After Vicksburg, Union authorities tried to resurrect the cotton plantations with wage labor, but they forced the formerly enslaved people to sign labor contracts with former plantation owners. Unlike before the war, laborers would be paid wages, provided with education free from physical punishment, and their families were safe from the disruption of sale. Neither side was satisfied with the new system, with blacks resenting labor contracts and the continuation of working for whites, and planters complaining of insubordinate workers. Only occasionally did Army officers seek to implement a different version of freedom, such as Grant at Davis Bend, Mississippi. Rather than being forced into contracts, at Davis Bend, land was divided among emancipated slaves, and a system of government was established allowing formerly enslaved people to elect their own judges and sheriffs. The future political status of African Americans became a central point of debate as the war continued, and events in Union-occupied Louisiana focused the nation on the question. Lincoln, hoping to establish a civilian government in that state, announced a 10% plan of Reconstruction. This offered amnesty and full restoration of rights, including property, except for enslaved people, to almost all white Southerners who swore loyalty to the Union and support for emancipation. When 10% of the voters of 1860 took the oath, they could elect a new state government, which would have to abolish slavery. Lincoln's plan offered no role for freed blacks, but he hoped that his plan would appeal to white Southerners and hasten the war's end. Free blacks in New Orleans, however, used the Union occupation to push for civil, legal, and political equality, and they found sympathy among radical Republicans in Congress, who, in 1864, passed the Wade-Davis Bill. This bill required a majority, not just 1/10 of white male Southerners, to pledge loyalty to the Union before Reconstruction could begin in any state, and it gave blacks legal equality, although not the vote. Lincoln vetoed the bill, and as the war came to a close, no plan for Reconstruction existed to follow its end. In November 1864, Sherman started a march to the sea from Atlanta to the Georgia coast. His forces destroyed railroads, buildings, and food and supplies to deny their use by Confederate troops. Sherman's vision of destroying civilian property and resources as a way to win the war was controversial but very modern. Sherman continued his path of destruction into South Carolina, freeing enslaved people and ruining plantations. On January 31, 1865, Congress approved the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the entire Union. In his second inaugural address in March 1865, Lincoln called for national reconciliation. On April 2nd, Grant finally pierced Lee's lines at Petersburg, causing Lee to retreat and abandon Richmond, which was occupied by Northern troops the next day. On April 4th, Lincoln, ignoring his own safety, walked Richmond streets accompanied by only a dozen sailors. Enslaved people celebrated and praised him everywhere he went. Lee and his army headed west, but were soon surrounded by Grant's army. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th, bringing the Civil War to an end. Only 5 days later, before he could announce plans to reconstruct the South, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a celebrated actor at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. His body was transported to Springfield by a winding railroad route that demonstrated how tightly bound by transportation and economy the northern states had become. Mourners lined the train route, and thousands viewed his body in state in major cities before he was laid to rest on May 4th, 1865. The war reverberated in the rest of the world, particularly in Europe. When Grant toured Europe in 1877 after retiring from the presidency, he was greeted as a hero. In England, nobles hailed him as a military genius. Workers there welcomed him as the general who saved the world's leading experiment in democracy on behalf of a president, Abraham Lincoln, who had vindicated free labor by emancipating the enslaved people. Otto von Bismarck, Germany's powerful chancellor, welcomed Grant as a nation builder. The Civil War truly did build the modern American nation, preserving the Union, destroying slavery, and shifting power in the nation from the South to the North, and from slave owning planters to Northern capitalists. It greatly expanded the power of the federal government and quickened the Northern economy's modernization. The war also made central the task of defining and protecting freedom for African Americans. But both sides had lost something they had fought the war to protect. The South had fought to protect slavery, which had been destroyed. And the North, which had fought for the world of free labor, the small shop, and the independent farmer, had been transformed into an industrialized nation. A vision of freedom founded in free labor was the task confronting the post war nation. Blacks who had achieved equality in death and struggle were now seeking that freedom in life, as Frederick Douglass proclaimed. The work does not end with the abolition of slavery, but only begins. And that is our last section. See you next time.